All right, so this is part 7 of Wrong Side Up. And when we last left off, William was talking about the bumper crop that was growing in the settlement, and everybody was talking about and celebrating. And we picked that up as he's reflecting on how he himself was experiencing that because he didn't have much of crop planted that year, and so felt as though he was missing out a bit. But we'll pick that up with this. He said, every time I drove to church, having my first team that year, and there is a picture here of that first team that he had, to give you a better idea of what that was and what it looked like for him to be riding around the countryside. Every time I drove to church, having my first team that year, I could not help seeing those fields of waving grain. I consoled myself with the thought that there would be much help needed on the threshing crews, so I also would get my share indirectly, as wages for a man and team would be $5 a day, plus board for man and team. I already signed up with an outfit in the community that had bought a new separator on the strength of the harvest that was to come. Not only was the grain crop a bumper one, but also all the gardens and potato patches looked wonderful. So not only would the granaries be filled with grain, but the cellars also would be well stocked for the winter that was to follow. It was now getting along towards the end of July, and it so happened that our home missionary was to be with us that Sunday, before harvesting began in earnest on the following day. One of the elders hauled the reverend from town on Saturday afternoon, and that good old man was shown the sights along the way. Wasn't that a wonderful sight? Yes, indeed, God has surely heard the prayers of our people, and tomorrow we will meet together in his house and give him thanks for the harvest that is at hand. And here is the picture of that church that they built. It was Sunday morning. Sunshine and white fleecy clouds in the sky. Yes, it was a beautiful morning and fine harvest weather. That was what was being thought and said as the people went to the house of God that day. The minister was also inspired by the promising outlook and preached a healthy reformed sermon that morning. But the large crowd came in the afternoon, as the distance was too great for some to come twice. That afternoon, the church was filled to capacity. Those people were faithful churchgoers, and especially so on a Sunday when a minister filled the pulpit. So all were there to hear a sermon on gratitude, and how that old man of God prayed and thanked God for the crop that was ready to harvest. While in church, we noticed the sky getting cloudy. The air became hot and sticky, and the people glanced at the sky as they came out of church and hooked up the teams to their wagons. It will blow over, says the weather prophet. See, it's getting lighter there in the west. These people were not afraid of some rain, but it was well known by all of them that sometimes hail would fall at this altitude. All went home soon after the service, and the minister went to an elder's home that stood within a mile of the church. We will follow the minister to the elder's home. First, a cup of tea was served while the sky kept getting darker, and inside of half an hour, the sky became black. Suddenly, the wind began to blow, and a few splashes of rain fell against the windows of the room in which the elder and family were entertaining the minister. The women had begun to set the table for an early supper. Some dishes had already been set when suddenly a blast of wind smashed both windows, and a driving hailstorm struck the house. The elder and minister picked up the table and slammed it against the broken windows. The wind was so strong and the hail hit so hard that they dared not let the table go. So they stood holding the table against the storm while the hailstones were rattling inside around their knees. Not a word was spoken while they stood there, although they glanced at each other from time to time. All of their strength was needed to hold the table in place. The water swished 4 inches over the floor. The women and children retreated to other rooms at the east end of the house. Would the house hold out? That was the question in the minds of these men as the wind drove with increasing fury. If they let the table down, the wind would have free play inside, and then what? So they hung on. 5, 10, 15 minutes go by. The noise was deafening, a continual drumming as the large hailstones hit roof and siding. Not a window in the west side of any house or church in the entire settlement stood up under the bombardment. As suddenly as the storm began, so it stopped. Just a few drops of rain, and it was all past. The table was let down, their arms lame of holding it up for so long. They glanced outside, and oh, what a sight. The hailstones were piled around the house, even up to the windows, and were frozen together in a solid chunk. Not a word was spoken as the elder glanced towards the church. His eyes must cross what once was a field of waving grain. Not an hour ago he had driven his family through it. And now? Words cannot describe the desolation wrought in those few minutes. The whole field was as white as snow. Not a stalk of grain was to be seen. Where was all that beautiful waving grain? It was under a cake of ice. But look, the ice is melting fast, and half an hour after the storm, the fields were covered with water, ice water made by the melting hailstones. The creeks all began to rise and became raging torrents of icy black water that took everything that stood in its way, along with it, to the lake 12 miles away. At first, the utter destruction was not apparent in that our friends could not go far from the house on account of the water and mud that was over everything. They looked for the stock in the nearby pasture, but those animals had run with the storm and are nowhere to be seen. The yard was full of dead chickens. They quickly count 45 of them. They lay where the hail had struck them before they could get to shelter. This shows how fast those hailstorms strike. Some hens were only 10 feet from shelter, but owing to wind and hail, were stuck as if nailed to the ground. Some were pounded to pulp. Others were stripped of feathers and were black and blue. The garden patch was to the west of the house on a slope, and potatoes, carrots, and beets were scattered all over the yard where they had been washed after being pounded out of the ground. Potatoes had holes in them as large as a man's thumb. Carrots were cut in two. It's hard to describe what a field or a wheat field looked like after that storm. It looked like fresh plowed ground in places. In other places, like one had disked it 6 or 7 times with disks 2 inches apart. The longest straw I could find the next day by scratching in the ground was only 2 inches long. There was no sign that there ever had been a crop. For a strip of country 50 miles wide and 150 miles long. Millions of bushels of grain were pounded into the soil in just 15 minutes. Some fields that were miraculously missed close to this area brought yields of 45 bushels of wheat and 90 bushels of oats. Man has not invented machinery that can do the job which that hailstorm did in one operation in so short a time. The west side of every house looked like 50 men had shot at it with buckshot for an hour or so. There was not a square inch which had not been hit and dented. The windows in the church also went out with the first blast, and the curtains were cut to ribbons a half-inch wide from top to bottom. Even the cedar fence posts, which were used so much in those days, were chipped and splintered. Hundreds of chickens were killed in the settlement. Cows and horses were killed by running into barbed wire fences, and of all those thousands of acres of grain, only a handful was left to see the sunset on that July Sunday. Our friend, the minister, never said a word. The following day, some horses were caught, and he was brought back to the railroad. Years later, I asked the elder, "What did the minister say?" "Not a word," said the elder. Not a word. The old missionary had been struck speechless. Had not these people worked hard to get a crop? Had they not thanked God that very day as they gathered in his house? What was wrong that God had taken it all away and in a moment of time? Did God want these people to stay here and call a minister or not? Had the church building for which so much had been sacrificed been built for nothing? The people asked all of these questions, and we think that the man of God asked them also. Where must we look for an answer to these questions? The psalmist said, "Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a guide unto my path." For an answer we must look to the law of God, and that is a mirror which reflects the life of those who look into the face of the law. Then the true Christian says, "It was God's will, and we have merited none of his blessings and have transgressed all of his commandments." While all of this was happening to the greater part of the Dutch settlement, Not a hailstone had fallen on my homestead. But by 6 o'clock that evening, my little creek had become a raging torrent. Though normally 3 feet wide and 6 inches deep, it became 100 feet wide and 15 feet deep and took all before it that came in its path. One of my granaries, built too close to the creek, rose majestically and sailed away down the stream. It finally stuck a bar a half-mile downstream and teetered there precariously until the water receded. This took 12 hours, and it was fully 2 days before the creek was normal again. I lost most of my tools, and a barrel of salt melted away as the door came unhooked and swished open and shut in the waves. The hogs in the pen kept on swimming until the water got deep enough for them to swim over the fence to high ground. They began to root in the grain at once, as though this was a daily occurrence. My wife and I had prepared to carry our furniture out in case the water would reach the house, but as the house stood on somewhat higher ground, the water did not quite reach it. I made up my mind that night to go up to the divide the next day in order to see where all the water had come from. It was a sobering trip. The next weeks were hot and sunny, so that the grain that had been literally pounded into the soil sprouted and came up at once. There was no lack of moisture now, and inside of 2 weeks the fields looked like an immense rug, a green rug, the nap of which was so thick that one could stand on it. If we stop to think that normally 1 to 2 bushels of seed was sown per acre, and now 45 bushels had been sown, we obtain an idea of the growth which stood on those fields inside of 2 weeks. As has been said, the grain had been all ripe and ready to cut, and so every kernel grew. The men who had cut a few rounds the Saturday before the storm looked in vain for those golden bundles. Only a few binder twines were found with a few straws clinging to them. After the effects of the first shock had worn off somewhat, for a man can take stunning blows and still survive, they at once made plans for the future. All of them realized that no crop could be had from that immense volunteer sowing of grain. To plow the fields and reseed them was out of the question, for they had no money and no seed. So they began to disk and disk some more. As fast as one layer of seed was killed, more sprouted and came up. So when fall came and it was too late to do more, everyone said the stand is still too heavy. And so it proved to be. For that summer, meaning the following summer, the grain only grew to a length of 6 inches and headed out. Each little head brought forth only 6 kernels. So the crop was again disked in, for the stalks were too short to harvest. Thus for 2 years nothing had been harvested, and the banks were becoming more urgent in expecting the notes to be paid. Interest payments also began to accumulate, which put some folks totally in the hands of the bankers. Everything was mortgaged, crop, chattel, and livestock. At last, some of the people thought it was hopeless to continue and wait for another crop, although there were still many folks who said, "This cannot last. Next year we'll hit it." But the next year proved too dry, and that settled it for 1/2 of the congregation. Auction sales were the order of the day. The banks saw to it that a representative of the bank was the clerk of sales, so they got what little cash was remaining. Oh, the discouraged people who, after 5 and 6 years of struggle, some even 7 and 8, had to bid farewell to their homes and in many cases leave dear ones behind in the churchyard cemetery. The dreadful flu epidemic had also taken its toll of these settlers, even though they were living far from town and city. This was not only true of our Dutch settlement, but also of hundreds of miles of territory all over the West, where dry land farming have proved to be a hazardous undertaking. In all of these years, large crops were grown on that same type of soil in the irrigated regions. That's where we will leave off today. The next chapter, as he had just referred to, ironic due to our current situation, is on the flu epidemic. The huge flu epidemic of 1917 and 18 was one that they lived through out there on the homestead, and so we'll pick it up there. And yet, sobering questions that were left in the minds of these believers, and questions that he will continue to grapple with as he brings his memoir of those years to a conclusion over the next days. But rest in the provisions of God and in the promises of him that are true and good for us each day, and we will pick it up there tomorrow. Bye-bye.